So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Every single person who has ever lived on this planet has, at some point, been sick. Every single one. And every single one of them wanted to feel better. That impulse, that desperate, deeply human need to ease suffering, to fix what's broken, to make the pain stop, that's the thread we're going to follow tonight. It stretches back tens of thousands of years, and it winds through some of the most fascinating, strange, heartbreaking, and genuinely brilliant moments in all of human history. Medicine, the whole story from the very beginning. And we're going to take it slow, because there's no rush. You're exactly where you need to be. Now, let's start where it actually starts, which is long before anything we'd recognize as a hospital or a prescription or even a bandage. Let's go way, way back. Imagine a world before writing, before cities, before agriculture. We're talking about early humans, anatomically modern humans, living in small groups, moving through landscapes, hunting, gathering, surviving, and getting hurt, getting sick, breaking bones, eating something that made their stomach seize up, watching a child burn with fever. These things happened constantly, and here's the thing, they didn't just accept it. We know this because of bones. Bones are incredible storytellers if you know how to read them. Paleoanthropologists have found skeletal remains tens of thousands of years old that show clear evidence of healed fractures. Not just fractures that knit themselves back together haphazardly, but fractures that were set, aligned, splinted. Someone helped that person. Someone looked at a broken arm and thought, I need to hold this straight while it mends, and that someone did it well enough that the bone healed cleanly. We've found Neanderthal remains, not even our own species, but our close cousins, dating back 50, 60,000 years, showing individuals who survived severe injuries and lived for years afterward. Individuals who couldn't have fed themselves, couldn't have kept up with the group, which means the group carried them, cared for them. That's medicine in its most elemental form, not a technique, not a theory, just the refusal to let someone suffer alone. Think about what that means. Before we had language complex enough to describe what a liver does, before we had any concept of infection or circulation or cells, we had compassion, and compassion is, in a very real sense, the first medical instrument. But compassion alone doesn't cure disease. And early humans figured that out pretty quickly. So they started experimenting. They watched animals. This is actually documented in several indigenous traditions and has some basis in observed behavior. Certain animals, when they're sick, will seek out specific plants they don't normally eat. Chimpanzees, for instance, have been observed swallowing rough leaves whole, which seems to help clear intestinal parasites. Early humans almost certainly noticed things like this. They watched, They tried things. They remembered what worked. Chew this root when your stomach hurts. Press these leaves against a wound. Breathe the steam from this boiling bark. And over generations, through pure trial and error, and probably a fair number of poisonings along the way, they built up a pharmacopoeia, an oral tradition of plant-based remedies passed down from healer to healer, parent to child, elder to apprentice. And here's what's genuinely remarkable. A lot of it worked. Not all of it, not perfectly, but a surprising amount of traditional plant medicine turns out to have real, measurable pharmacological effects. Willow bark, used by indigenous peoples across multiple continents for pain and fever, contains salicin, which your body converts into something very close to aspirin. The opium poppy, cultivated for thousands of years, gives us morphine. Foxglove, used in European folk medicine for heart conditions, is the source of digitalis, which is still used in cardiac care today. Quinine from cinchona bark. Ephedrine from the ma huang plant, used in Chinese medicine for over 5,000 years. These aren't coincidences. These are the accumulated observations of countless generations of people paying very close attention to what happened when you put certain substances into the human body. So that's the foundation. Observation, memory, transmission. But here's where it gets more complicated and honestly more interesting. Because early humans didn't just want to know what worked, they wanted to know why. And without any understanding of biology, without microscopes, without chemistry, they reached for the explanations that made sense to them, spiritual ones. If you got sick and nobody could see a reason, no wound, no broken bone, no obvious poison, then something invisible must be at work, a spirit, a curse, an imbalance in some unseen force. And the person who could intercede with those invisible forces, who could diagnose which spirit was angry and why, who knew the rituals and the chants and the sacred plants, that person became the healer, the shaman, the medicine man or woman. And this is where medicine and religion become so deeply intertwined that for most of human history, you genuinely cannot separate them. Healing was a sacred act. Illness was a spiritual event. The healer was a priest. Now, it's tempting to dismiss all of this as superstition. But let's not do that, because it's more nuanced than it looks. Yes, the theoretical framework was wrong. Diseases aren't caused by angry spirits. But the practices that grew up around that framework often had real therapeutic value. Rituals created a sense of calm, of being cared for, of community support. And we know today that psychological state has measurable effects on immune function and recovery. The placebo effect isn't nothing. It's a real, documented neurochemical phenomenon. When you believe you're being healed, your brain releases endorphins, modulates pain perception, even affects inflammation. Those ancient healers were triggering that response every single time they performed a ceremony. They were also In many cases, administering genuinely effective herbal medicines alongside the ritual, so the patient got real pharmacology, plus real psychological benefit, plus social support. That's honestly not a bad treatment plan, but anyway, let's move forward. Because at some point, around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, something changes everything. Writing. Once you can write things down, knowledge stops being limited by the memory of the oldest person in the village. It accumulates, it compounds, and the first great written medical traditions emerge in the places you'd probably expect: Mesopotamia and Egypt. Let's start with Mesopotamia, because it's the oldest we have clear records for. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, left behind thousands of clay tablets, and some of them are medical texts. One of the oldest, dating to around 2100 BCE, is a Sumerian tablet that lists about a dozen medical recipes, poultices, washes, filtrates. It describes combining specific minerals, plant materials, and animal products, mixing them with beer or wine, which, by the way, served as both a solvent and a mild antiseptic, though they didn't know that, and applying them in specific ways. What's striking about this particular tablet is that it contains almost no magical incantations. It's remarkably practical. Here's the problem. Here's the recipe. Apply it like this. Almost like a cookbook for illness, but that's the exception. Most Mesopotamian medical practice was deeply embedded in divination and ritual. The primary medical practitioner in Babylonian society was the Ashipu, essentially an exorcist priest whose job was to diagnose which demon or which sin had caused the illness and to perform the appropriate ritual to drive it out. There was also the Asu, a more practically oriented healer who worked with drugs and bandages and physical treatments. The two roles overlapped and sometimes competed, and honestly, if you were sick in ancient Babylon, you probably saw both. The Ashipu would figure out the spiritual cause, while the Asu treated your symptoms. Belt and suspenders. The Babylonians also gave us something fascinating: extensive diagnostic texts. The most important collection is called the Diagnostic Handbook, compiled around 1000 BCE by a scholar named Ezekiel Kinaple. It's organized head to toe. It starts with symptoms of the skull and works its way down through the body, listing symptoms, grouping them into recognizable patterns, and in many cases offering prognoses. Some of the descriptions are remarkably specific. There are passages that modern physicians have identified as likely descriptions of epilepsy, stroke, various fevers, and tuberculosis. Now, the explanations are still supernatural. This symptom means the hand of this god is upon the patient, but the observations themselves are sharp, careful, clinical even. Someone was paying very close attention to sick people and writing down exactly what they saw. And then there's Egypt. Oh, Egypt is wonderful. If you want to understand how far ancient medicine actually got, Egypt is where you need to look. The Egyptians left behind several major medical papyri, and they're extraordinary documents. The most famous is probably the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, but believed to be a copy of a text originally written perhaps 1,000 years earlier. It's named after the American collector who bought it from a dealer in Luxor in 1862, and when scholars finally translated it, they were stunned. It's a surgical textbook, 48 cases, organized from head to toe, each one following the same format: title, examination, diagnosis, and treatment. If you examine a man having a break in the column of his nose being disfigured and a depression being in it, you should say concerning him, one having a break in the column of his nose, an ailment which I will treat. That's a direct translation. Look at the structure of that. Examine, diagnose, classify the prognosis. The text uses 3 categories, which roughly translate to an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. That last one is essentially triage, the recognition that some injuries are beyond what medicine can fix. That's an incredibly sophisticated concept, and the treatments described are practical: stitching wounds, setting fractures, applying raw meat as a compress to reduce swelling, using honey on wounds, which we now know has genuine antibacterial properties. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is remarkable partly for what it doesn't contain much of: magic. It's overwhelmingly rational and observational, but it exists alongside other texts like the Ebers Papyrus, which is a much larger document and mixes practical pharmacology with incantations freely. The Ebers Papyrus contains over 700 remedies for everything from crocodile bites to depression, and it gives us a window into just how extensive the Egyptian pharmacopoeia was. Hundreds of plant, mineral, and animal substances combined in specific proportions, administered in specific ways. Some of it is genuinely effective. Some of it is, to put it gently, not. There's a remedy that involves mouse bones. There's one that calls for fly droppings, but mixed in with the questionable ingredients are things like castor oil for constipation, which absolutely works, and various copper-based compounds for eye infections, which have real antimicrobial properties. And here's something about Egyptian medicine that doesn't get enough attention: specialization. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE, noted with some amazement that Egyptian doctors specialized. There were doctors for the eyes, doctors for the teeth, doctors for the stomach, doctors for internal diseases. This is 2,500 years ago, and they already had the equivalent of ophthalmologists and gastroenterologists. The level of institutional development is remarkable. There were court physicians, military surgeons, and what we might call public health officials. There was a hierarchy training, titles, and the Egyptians had another advantage that most ancient cultures didn't: mummification. Now, they weren't doing dissection for medical purposes, at least not that we know of, but the embalmers who prepared bodies for burial had an intimate, hands-on familiarity with human anatomy that was essentially unmatched in the ancient world. They removed and handled internal organs routinely. They knew what a liver looked like, what lungs looked like, where the intestines sat. Whether that anatomical knowledge crossed over to the physicians is debated, but it's hard to imagine it didn't, at least informally. In a culture that's sophisticated, people talk, but for all their skill, the Egyptians were still working within a framework that mixed the empirical and the magical without really distinguishing between them. A doctor might set your broken bone with real expertise and then recite a spell over it, and in his mind, both actions were equally important parts of the treatment. The idea that you could separate natural causes from supernatural ones, that disease might operate according to rules you could discover through reason alone, that idea hadn't quite arrived yet. For that, we need to move east and then west. We need to talk about what was happening in India, in China, and eventually in a small rocky peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, where a handful of Greek thinkers were about to change everything about how we understand the human body. So let's start in India, because something really interesting was brewing there, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention in Western histories of medicine. By roughly 600 BCE, and possibly earlier, Indian physicians were developing a comprehensive medical system that would eventually be written down in texts of extraordinary sophistication. The two big ones are the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, and while the exact dates of their composition are debated, some scholars place the earliest layers as far back as the 6th century BCE. Others think the texts as we have them were compiled and revised over several centuries. What matters is the ideas inside them, because these aren't just collections of remedies. They're systematic attempts to explain how the body works, why it gets sick, and what you can do about it. The underlying framework is what's known as Ayurveda, which literally means the science of life, or the knowledge of longevity, and the core concept is balance. The body, in this view, is governed by three fundamental substances or forces called doshas: vata, pitta, and kapha. You can think of them loosely as wind, fire, and water, though that's a simplification. Vata governs movement and the nervous system. Pitta governs metabolism and digestion. Kapha governs structure and lubrication. When these three are in balance, you're healthy. When they fall out of balance because of diet, behavior, seasonal changes, emotional stress, or just your individual constitution, disease follows. Treatment, then, is about restoring balance through diet, through herbal medicines, through lifestyle changes, through purification procedures. Now, If you're thinking that sounds a bit like the Greek idea of the four humors, you're not wrong. There's a real structural similarity. The idea that health is equilibrium and disease is imbalance. Whether there was actual cross-pollination between Indian and Greek medical thought is one of those questions historians love to argue about. There were trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to the Indian subcontinent, so it's not impossible. But it's also entirely plausible that different civilizations, observing the same human body and the same patterns of illness, arrived at similar conceptual frameworks independently. The human desire to find balance, to see health as harmony, seems to be something close to universal. But here's where Indian medicine gets really remarkable. And this is the part that doesn't get enough credit. The Sushruta Samhita, attributed to a physician named Sushruta, who may have lived and taught in the city of Varanasi, is essentially a surgical textbook, and it is astonishingly detailed. Sushruta describes over 120 surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, trocars, probes, needles, saws. He classifies surgical procedures into categories: excision, incision, scraping, puncturing, probing, extracting, draining. He discusses how to train surgical students, and his method is beautiful in its practicality. He had students practice incisions on watermelons and cucumbers. They practiced probing on worm-eaten wood. They practiced extraction techniques on the seeds of fruits. They sutured on pieces of leather and cloth. Only after mastering these exercises on inanimate objects would they move to actual patients. That's a training methodology. That's a curriculum. And then there's rhinoplasty. Sushruta describes a procedure for reconstructing a nose, specifically using a flap of skin from the forehead, rotated down and shaped to form a new nose, with tubes inserted to maintain the nostrils while it healed. This is not a minor thing. Nose amputation was a common punishment in ancient India for certain crimes and social transgressions, so there was real demand for reconstruction, and the technique Sushruta described is recognizably, fundamentally, the same approach that plastic surgeons refined in Europe over 2,000 years later. When British surgeons in India in the late 1700s observed local practitioners performing this forehead flap rhinoplasty, they were stunned. They wrote about it in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1794, and it kicked off the modern development of plastic surgery in Europe, a technique that had been practiced in India for millennia. Sushruta also described cataract surgery, specifically a technique called couching, where a curved needle was used to push the opaque lens out of the line of vision. It wasn't lens replacement, and it had real limitations and risks, but it could restore some degree of sight to people who were effectively blind. He wrote about the surgical management of intestinal obstructions, the draining of abscesses, the removal of bladder stones. He discussed wound care, the importance of cleanliness, the use of wine, and specific herbal preparations to clean wounds, which, while not antisepsis in the modern sense, shows an intuitive grasp that contamination was dangerous. So Indian medicine, at its best, was remarkably empirical and practical, especially in surgery. It existed within a broader philosophical and spiritual framework, absolutely, but the surgical tradition in particular was grounded in observation, technique, and hands-on training in a way that's genuinely impressive. Now let's shift to China, because a parallel tradition was developing there with its own internal logic and its own remarkable innovations. Chinese medicine, like Indian medicine, is built around the concept of balance. In this case, the balance of yin and yang, two complementary forces whose interplay governs everything in nature, including the human body. Illness arises when yin and yang fall out of harmony, or when the flow of qi, the vital energy that circulates through the body along specific pathways called meridians, becomes blocked or disrupted. The foundational text is the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's classic of internal medicine, traditionally attributed to the legendary Yellow Emperor, but actually compiled over centuries, probably reaching something like its current form around the 2nd or 1st century BCE. It's structured as a dialogue between the emperor and his physician, and it lays out the theoretical foundations of Chinese medicine in remarkable detail. It discusses anatomy, physiology, diagnosis, and treatment. It emphasizes prevention, the idea that the best doctor treats illness before it manifests, by helping the patient maintain balance through proper diet, exercise, emotional regulation, and harmony with the seasons. And here's where one of the most distinctive practices in all of medical history comes in: acupuncture. The idea that inserting thin needles at specific points along the body's meridians can restore the proper flow of qi and treat disease. Now, the mechanism as traditionally described doesn't map onto Western anatomy or physiology in any straightforward way. There's no anatomical structure corresponding to meridians, and qi as a substance hasn't been identified by modern science. But here's the thing: acupuncture has been practiced continuously for over 2,000 years, and modern research has shown that it does produce measurable physiological effects. Needle insertion triggers the release of endorphins and other neurotransmitters. It activates specific nerve pathways. For certain conditions, particularly chronic pain, nausea, and some musculoskeletal problems, it performs better than placebo in well-designed trials. The traditional explanation of why it works may not hold up, but the observation that it does something real, for at least some conditions, seems increasingly solid. It's a fascinating case of a practice that was right about the what, even if the why was framed in terms that modern science can't validate. Chinese medicine also developed an extraordinarily sophisticated herbal pharmacology. The Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing, or the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica, compiled around the 1st or 2nd century CE, catalogs 365 substances, plants, minerals, animal products, classified by their properties and effects. And like the Egyptian and Indian pharmacopoeias, many of these have proven pharmacologically active. Ephedra, which we mentioned earlier, was used in Chinese medicine for thousands of years to treat respiratory conditions. Artemisinin, the most important antimalarial drug developed in the 20th century, was derived from sweet wormwood, a plant used in Chinese medicine for fevers for over 1,000 years. The scientist who isolated it, Tu Yu, won the Nobel Prize in 2015, and she explicitly credited the ancient Chinese medical texts as her starting point. That's a direct line from traditional practice to Nobel Prize-winning pharmacology. Spanning 2 millennia, Chinese physicians also developed sophisticated diagnostic techniques, particularly pulse diagnosis, the art of reading the pulse at the radial artery of the wrist with extraordinary subtlety, distinguishing dozens of different pulse qualities that corresponded to different conditions and organ systems. A skilled practitioner would place 3 fingers along the wrist and assess the pulse at each position for depth, speed, strength, rhythm, and quality. It's an art that takes years to master, and while its diagnostic specificity is debated by modern medicine, the underlying principle that the cardiovascular system carries information about the body's overall state is absolutely sound. Your pulse does change with fever, with dehydration, with heart disease, with anxiety, with 100 different conditions. Chinese medicine just developed an exceptionally refined vocabulary for reading those changes. So by roughly the last few centuries BCE, you have these 3 great medical traditions, Egyptian, Indian, and Chinese, each with real empirical achievements, each embedded in broader philosophical or spiritual frameworks, each accumulating knowledge across generations through written texts and apprenticeship training. They're all doing real medicine. They're all helping real patients, but they're all, to varying degrees, still operating within systems where the natural and the supernatural, the empirical and the theoretical, are woven together in ways that make it hard to test one idea against another. If your treatment doesn't work, is it because the herbs were wrong, or because the spiritual diagnosis was off, or because the patient's karma or fate was simply unfavorable? There's no clean way to isolate variables, and that brings us, finally, to Greece, specifically to a small island called Kos in the eastern Aegean Sea, sometime around 460 BCE, where a boy was born into a family of physicians. His name was Hippocrates, and while the mythology around him has grown so thick over the centuries that it's genuinely difficult to separate the man from the legend, the core of what he represents, or what the tradition associated with his name represents, is one of the most important shifts in the entire history of human thought. Not just medical thought, human thought. Here's what the Hippocratic physicians did that was different. They didn't just treat disease. They didn't just catalog remedies. They made an argument, a philosophical argument, that disease has natural causes, only natural causes. That when someone gets sick, it's not because a god is angry, not because a demon has entered their body, not because of a curse or a sin. It's because something has gone wrong in the body itself, something physical, something that operates according to principles that can be observed, discussed, and understood by human reason. And that single idea, that disease is a natural phenomenon, not a supernatural punishment, changes everything. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you're a healer working within a framework where illness might be caused by an offended deity, then part of your job is divination. Part of your job is figuring out which god you've upset, what ritual will appease them, what sacrifice needs to be made. And those are questions that can't really be answered empirically. You can't design a test to determine whether Apollo is angry. But the moment you say, no, this fever is happening because of something in the body, something about the air, the diet, the water, the season, the patient's constitution, suddenly you're in a domain where observation matters, where you can compare one patient to another, where you can notice patterns, where you can be wrong in a way that's productive, because being wrong about a natural cause points you toward a better natural explanation, whereas being wrong about which god to blame just points you toward a different god. Now, I want to be careful here, because it's easy to overstate this. The Hippocratic physicians didn't invent observation. We've already talked about how the Egyptians were doing careful wound assessment, how Sushruta was meticulously describing surgical procedures, how Chinese physicians were developing incredibly nuanced pulse diagnosis. Those traditions were deeply observational, and the Hippocratic physicians didn't completely abandon every trace of the mystical. There are prayers and references to the divine scattered through some of the Hippocratic texts. But what they did, and what makes them so significant, is they drew a line. They said, when we're doing medicine, we're doing natural philosophy. We're looking for natural explanations, and anything that invokes the supernatural is frankly lazy. There's a famous passage in the Hippocratic text called On the Sacred Disease, the sacred disease being epilepsy, which in the ancient world was widely believed to be caused by divine possession. And the author, we don't know exactly who, because the Hippocratic corpus is actually a collection of about 60 texts written by multiple authors over roughly a century. But the author of this particular text is just scathing about the idea that epilepsy is sacred. He argues that calling it sacred is actually a cover for ignorance, that the people who claim it's caused by gods are the ones who don't understand it, and they hide behind the divine explanation precisely because they can't offer a natural one. And then he proposes that epilepsy originates in the brain. He's wrong about the specific mechanism. He thinks it has to do with phlegm blocking air passages in the brain. But the impulse, the direction of the reasoning, is extraordinary for the 5th century BCE. The brain, not Zeus, the brain. And this connects to something really important about the Hippocratic approach, which is the emphasis on prognosis. The Hippocratic physicians were almost obsessed with prognosis, with predicting the course of a disease. And that might seem like a strange priority, but think about why it matters. If you can observe a patient, note their symptoms, and then accurately predict what's going to happen next, the fever will break on the 7th day, or the swelling will spread to the left side, then you're demonstrating that disease follows patterns, predictable, natural patterns. You're proving, case by case, that this isn't random divine caprice. It's a process with a trajectory. And if you watch carefully enough, you can learn to read that trajectory. The Hippocratic texts are full of these incredibly detailed case histories. The epidemics, especially books 1 and 3, contain what are essentially the first clinical case reports in Western medicine. Real patients in real places, observed day by day. A man in Thasos who developed a fever on such and such a day, whose urine changed color on the 4th day, who became delirious on the 6th, who died on the 11th or didn't die. The outcomes aren't always grim, but they're always recorded with this meticulous, almost clinical detachment. Here's what happened. Here's what I observed, and the honesty is striking. The physician records the cases where the patient died just as carefully as the ones where they recovered. There's no attempt to hide failures, because the point isn't to prove that the doctor is brilliant. The point is to build a body of observed knowledge about how diseases actually behave. Now, the theoretical framework, the Hippocratic, physicians used to explain all this was humoral theory, and I should probably talk about that, because it dominated Western medicine for an almost absurdly long time, roughly 2,000 years, give or take. The basic idea is that the body contains 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is a state of balance among these 4 humors. Disease is an imbalance, and if you're thinking that sounds a lot like the balance-based frameworks we already talked about, the 3 doshas in Ayurveda, the yin-yang equilibrium in Chinese medicine, you're absolutely right. There's a deep structural similarity there, and scholars have debated for centuries whether these ideas developed independently or whether there was some cross-pollination through trade routes and cultural contact. We may never know for certain, but the pattern itself is fascinating. This recurring human intuition that health is about balance, that the body is a system of forces that need to be in harmony. Here's where humoral theory gets interesting, though. Each humor was associated with a season, an element, and a temperament. Blood was linked to air, spring, and a sanguine personality, warm, cheerful, optimistic. Phlegm was water, winter, calm and sluggish. Yellow bile was fire, summer, choleric, irritable, aggressive. Black bile was earth, autumn, melancholic, sad, contemplative, and this framework didn't just explain disease, it explained personality. It explained why people are different from each other. Your particular balance of humors made you who you are, which means that in the Hippocratic worldview, medicine and psychology were essentially the same discipline. Your body and your temperament were expressions of the same underlying system. We still carry echoes of this in our language, by the way. When you describe someone as having a sanguine outlook, or a melancholic disposition, or a phlegmatic response, you're using humoral vocabulary. Those words come directly from this 2,500-year-old medical theory. The problem, of course, is that humoral theory is wrong. There are no four humors governing health, but, and this is a really important but, the framework was productive in certain ways. It encouraged physicians to think about the whole patient, not just the disease. It made them pay attention to diet, exercise, sleep, environment, emotional state. The Hippocratic text, Airs, Waters, and Places, is essentially an early treatise on environmental medicine and epidemiology. It argues that to understand why people in a particular city get sick, you need to study the prevailing winds, the quality of the water supply, the orientation of the city relative to the sun. That's not mysticism. That's public health thinking. Crude, yes. Based on a flawed theoretical framework, absolutely. But the instinct that disease patterns are shaped by environmental factors is completely correct. And it's an instinct that wouldn't really be fully vindicated until the 19th century, when people like John Snow started mapping cholera outbreaks and tracing them to contaminated water sources. But the seed of that idea is right there in Hippocrates, 24 centuries earlier. And then there's the ethical dimension, which we can't skip over. The Hippocratic Oath is probably the most famous ethical document in the history of medicine, and while the version that modern physicians take has been substantially modified, the original captures something essential about what the Hippocratic tradition was trying to establish: medicine as a profession with obligations. The idea that the physician has a duty to the patient to help, or at least to do no harm, to maintain confidentiality, to refuse to administer poison even if asked, to abstain from exploiting the vulnerable. Now, the original oath also includes some things that feel very much of their time: swearing by Apollo and Asclepius, prohibitions that may reflect specific philosophical commitments rather than universal principles. But the core impulse, the idea that medical knowledge creates ethical responsibility, that power over someone's body demands restraint and integrity, that idea has proven remarkably durable. It's still the foundation of medical ethics today. So Hippocrates, or the Hippocratic tradition, since we should be honest that we're really talking about a school of thought rather than a single man, establishes this new framework: natural causes, careful observation, detailed case histories, a theoretical model based on balance, an ethical code, and this framework gets picked up, elaborated, and eventually transformed by the person who is arguably the most influential physician in all of Western history. Not Hippocrates himself, but a man born about 600 years later, around 129 CE, in the city of Pergamon in what is now Western Turkey. His name was Galen, and his influence on medicine is almost impossible to overstate. For better and for worse, Galen was, by all accounts, brilliant, ambitious, and spectacularly confident in his own abilities. He was born into wealth. His father was a prosperous architect, and he received an extraordinary education, studying philosophy and medicine across the Mediterranean world. He spent time in Smyrna, in Corinth, and crucially in Alexandria, which was still, even in the 2nd century CE, one of the great centers of medical learning. And then he went to Rome, where he became physician to the gladiators, which gave him something that most physicians of his era rarely got: extensive experience with traumatic injuries, open wounds, exposed organs, the insides of living human bodies laid bare by combat. It was, in a grim way, an extraordinary anatomical education. But here's the thing about Galen that made him so different from the Hippocratic physicians, where they were cautious, empirical, almost humble in their case reports, recording what they saw without always insisting on a grand explanation. Galen was a systematizer. He wanted a complete theory of everything. He took humoral theory and elaborated it into an enormously complex, internally consistent system that explained not just disease, but physiology, anatomy, pharmacology, temperament, and the very purpose of every organ in the body. He was a teleological thinker. He believed every structure in the body existed for a reason, designed with purpose, and his anatomical writings are full of this almost reverential admiration for the body's design, which makes his work compelling to read, genuinely beautiful in places, but also introduces a fundamental problem, because when you start from the assumption that everything has a purpose, you tend to see purpose everywhere, even where it doesn't exist, and you tend to make your observations fit your theory rather than the other way around. Dr. and Galen had another problem, one that would haunt medicine for over 1,000 years. He couldn't dissect human bodies. Roman law prohibited it, so he dissected animals instead: pigs, goats, Barbary macaques, and then extrapolated to human anatomy. And sometimes the extrapolation was fine, because mammalian anatomy shares a lot of common ground. But sometimes it was wrong, significantly wrong. He described the human liver as having 5 lobes, like a pig's. He described a network of blood vessels at the base of the brain, the rete mirabile, that exists in ungulates but not in humans. And because Galen's authority became so enormous, because his writings were treated as essentially infallible for century after century, these errors weren't just mistakes, they became obstacles. They became walls that future anatomists would have to tear down before they could see what was actually in front of them. And that demolition project wouldn't really begin in earnest until the Renaissance, when a young anatomist in Padua decided to actually look for himself. His name was Andreas Vesalius, and he was barely into his 20s when he started pulling Galen's edifice apart, brick by brick, with nothing more than a scalpel and a willingness to trust his own eyes over 14 centuries of received wisdom. Vesalius was born in Brussels in 1514 into a family with deep medical roots. His father was a pharmacist who served the Holy Roman Emperor. His grandfather had been a physician, and the household was apparently full of medical texts. So young Andreas grew up surrounded by this stuff. He went to Paris to study medicine, and there he encountered the standard way anatomy was taught in the 16th century, which, honestly, sounds almost absurd to us now. The professor would sit in an elevated chair, literally above the proceedings, and read aloud from Galen's texts. Down below, a barber surgeon would do the actual cutting, the actual dissection, while the professor narrated from the book, and the students would watch. The professor rarely, if ever, touched the body. The barber surgeon was doing the manual labor, but wasn't the one interpreting what he found, and the text being read was Galen's, written over 1,000 years earlier, based on animal dissections. So you had this strange, disconnected triangle: the authority of the ancient text, the hands of the barber, and the eyes of the students, and nobody was really checking whether what Galen described actually matched what was lying on the table. Wingsuo found this intolerable. He was apparently the kind of student who couldn't keep his hands off the specimens. He'd sneak into charnel houses. He'd collect bones from cemeteries and execution sites. He'd beg for access to bodies. And when he got to the University of Padua, which was, at the time, one of the most intellectually open universities in Europe, partly because it was under Venetian control and Venice had a tradition of keeping the church at a certain arm's length from academic affairs. When he got to Padua, he did something revolutionary. He stepped down from the professor's chair and did the dissections himself, with his own hands, while teaching. He'd cut and point and show the students what was actually there, right in front of them. And what he found, over and over again, was that Galen was wrong, not about everything. Galen got a lot right, honestly, but the errors were significant, and they were systematic, and they all pointed in the same direction. They were errors you'd make if you were dissecting animals and assuming humans looked the same. The five-lobed liver, the rete mirabile, the shape of the human jawbone, which Galen described as being made of two pieces like a dog's, when in humans it's a single fused bone. The curve of the femur, the structure of the uterus. One by one, Vesalius documented these discrepancies, and in 1543, remember that year. It's one of those hinge points in intellectual history, The same year, Copernicus published his heliocentric model. Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. He was 28 years old, and here's what made the Fabrica so extraordinary. It wasn't just that it corrected Galen's errors, though it did. It wasn't just that it was based on actual human dissection, though that mattered enormously. It was that it was illustrated lavishly, meticulously, beautifully illustrated, with woodcut prints that are still stunning to look at. Nearly 500 years later, the illustrations were probably made in the workshop of Titian, the great Venetian painter, or at least by artists closely associated with him. The figures are shown in dramatic poses, standing in landscapes, their muscles peeled back layer by layer, their skeletons arranged as if contemplating their own mortality. They're works of art and works of science simultaneously, and they meant that for the first time, anatomical knowledge could be transmitted visually with real precision. You didn't have to be in the dissection theater. You could hold the book and see what the human body actually looked like inside. Now, think about what Vesalius was really doing here. He wasn't just fixing a few anatomical details. He was establishing a principle. The principle that observation trumps authority. That if what you see on the dissection table contradicts what the ancient text says, you go with what you see. That sounds obvious to us, but in the 16th century, it was genuinely radical. Galen's authority was so deeply entrenched that some of Vesalius's own teachers attacked him for daring to contradict the master. His former mentor in Paris, Jacobus Silvius, called him a madman and suggested that it was human anatomy that had changed since Galen's time, not that Galen had been wrong, which is a remarkable piece of mental gymnastics when you think about it. Rather than admit the ancient authority made errors, it was easier to claim that human bodies had somehow restructured themselves over 14 centuries. But Vesalius won. Not immediately, not without cost. He actually left anatomy shortly after publishing the Fabrica, burned some of his unpublished work, and became a court physician to Emperor Charles V, which was prestigious but a retreat from the cutting edge. The reasons are debated. Maybe the attacks got to him. Maybe he was frustrated. But the book outlived his retreat. It became the new standard and the tradition he established at Padua of hands-on, observation-based anatomical teaching continued and flourished. The anatomists who followed him there, people like Rialdo Colombo and Gabriele Fallopio, kept pushing, kept looking, kept finding things Galen had missed or gotten wrong, and this matters for the larger story of medicine because anatomy is foundational. You can't understand disease if you don't understand what the healthy body looks like. You can't do surgery effectively if your map of the body is wrong, and you certainly can't understand how the body works, its physiology, if you're starting from incorrect anatomy. So Vesalius didn't just correct a textbook. he cleared the ground for everything that came after. Namide inafni, which brings us to one of the most important everything that came after moments in all of medical history. Because once people started looking at the body with fresh eyes, once they started questioning old assumptions, one of the biggest questions they confronted was this: what is the blood actually doing? How does it move? Where does it go? Galen had an answer, and it was wrong in a very specific and consequential way. He believed that blood was produced in the liver from food, flowed outward through the veins to nourish the body, and was essentially consumed, used up by the tissues. Separately, he thought the arteries carried a different substance, a mixture of blood and pneuma, a kind of vital spirit drawn from the air through the lungs, and he believed that some blood passed from the right side of the heart to the left through invisible pores in the septum, the thick muscular wall dividing the heart's two sides. Those pores don't exist. Vesalius himself had looked for them and expressed doubt, though he stopped short of flatly denying Galen on this point. Colombo, his successor at Padua, went further and described pulmonary circulation, blood flowing from the right heart through the lungs and back to the left heart. An Islamic physician named Ibn al-Nafis had actually described this same pulmonary transit back in the 13th century, but his work was largely unknown in Europe. The person who put the whole picture together was William Harvey, an Englishman who had studied at, you guessed it, Padua. Harvey published De Motu Cordis in 1628, and in it he laid out the complete theory of blood circulation. The heart is a pump. It pushes blood out through the arteries. That blood returns through the veins. It's a closed loop, a continuous circuit, the same blood going around and around. Here's what's really clever about how Harvey figured this out. He didn't have a microscope. He couldn't see capillaries, the tiny vessels that connect arteries to veins at the tissue level. Marcello Malpighi wouldn't observe those until 1661, decades later, so Harvey couldn't directly see the complete circuit. But he could reason his way there, and his key argument was quantitative. He estimated the volume of blood the heart pumps with each beat, maybe 2 ounces, he figured, and multiplied by the number of heartbeats per hour, and he got a number that was enormous, far more blood than the body could possibly be manufacturing, fresh from food and consuming in the tissues the way Galen's model required. The only explanation that made sense was that the blood was being recycled. It had to be going in a circle. Think about that for a second. It's a beautifully simple argument. You don't need a microscope. You don't need fancy equipment. You just need to count heartbeats, estimate a volume, and do arithmetic, and the math demolishes the old theory. This is one of those moments where quantitative thinking, just putting numbers on things, changes everything. Harvey also did meticulous experiments with ligatures, tying off blood vessels and observing what happened. Tie off a vein, and the side away from the heart swells. Tie off an artery, and the side toward the heart swells. That tells you the direction of flow. He demonstrated the one-way valves in veins, which had been described anatomically by Fabricius, another Padua professor, but not correctly understood, and showed that they only made sense if blood in veins was flowing back toward the heart. Now, Harvey faced enormous resistance too. The Galenic establishment didn't go quietly. But his evidence was so strong, his reasoning so tight, that within a generation, circulation was accepted. And once you understand that blood circulates, that the heart is a mechanical pump driving fluid through a closed network of vessels, you've fundamentally changed what medicine can even think about. You can start to understand hemorrhage, shock, blood pressure. You can start to imagine transfusions. You can begin to grasp why a blockage in a vessel might kill the tissue downstream. The entire framework of cardiovascular medicine, everything from understanding heart attacks to performing open heart surgery, traces back to Harvey sitting in his study, counting heartbeats and doing multiplication. And here's something worth pausing on. From Vesalius to Harvey, you can see a pattern emerging, a methodology, really. Look for yourself. Measure things, count things, test your ideas against what you actually observe, not against what the authorities wrote. It sounds like the scientific method, and it basically is, being born in real time within medicine. But medicine was about to enter a period where this new empirical spirit would collide with problems it couldn't yet solve because the tools weren't there yet. The anatomy was getting better. The physiology was getting better. But when it came to actually treating sick people, to understanding why wounds got infected, why epidemics swept through cities, why a mother could die of fever days after a perfectly normal childbirth, for those questions, the 17th and 18th centuries were still largely groping in the dark, and the answers, when they finally came, would arrive from some unexpected directions. One of them involved a Dutch fabric merchant who had an unusual hobby, a man named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, living in Delft, in the Dutch Republic, sometime around the 1670s. And his story is one of those beautiful reminders that the biggest breakthroughs in science don't always come from the people you'd expect. Leeuwenhoek wasn't a physician. He wasn't a professor. He had no university education at all. He was a draper, a textile merchant, and his initial interest in lenses had nothing to do with medicine. He wanted to inspect the quality of cloth. That's it. When you're buying and selling fabric, you want to see the weave up close, check the thread count, look for imperfections. So he started grinding his own lenses, small glass beads really, polishing them with extraordinary patience and skill until they could magnify things far beyond what anyone else was achieving at the time. And here's what's remarkable. While other people were building compound microscopes, instruments with multiple lenses stacked together, which introduced all kinds of optical distortions. Leeuwenhoek stuck with single-lens devices, tiny handheld things, almost like a magnifying glass on a pin. But the quality of his lenses was so extraordinary, his grinding technique so precise, that he was achieving magnifications of 200, maybe 300 times. Nobody else was even close. And then he started looking at everything, not just fabric, everything. Pond water, scrapings from his own teeth, pepper water he'd left sitting out, rainwater collected in a barrel. And what he saw changed the world, even though it would take the world a very long time to understand what he'd found. He called them animalcules, little animals, tiny living things, swimming around in drops of water, wriggling, darting, spinning. Things no human eye had ever seen before. He was looking at bacteria. He was looking at protozoa. He was looking at the invisible living world that exists all around us, on us, inside us, in every drop of water and every speck of soil. And he was the first human being in history to see it. Now think about what that means for medicine. For thousands of years, people had been trying to understand why wounds fester, why plagues spread, why food rots, why fevers kill. And the answers were always things like bad air, imbalanced humors, divine punishment, miasma rising from swamps. Nobody could have imagined that the culprits might be living creatures too small to see. Leeuwenhoek didn't make that connection himself, not explicitly. He described what he saw, he drew it, he wrote letters about it, hundreds of letters to the Royal Society in London over the course of decades. But he didn't say, "These little creatures are causing disease." That leap would take another 2 centuries. But he opened the door. He showed that this invisible world existed. And once you know something exists, eventually someone is going to figure out what it does. And here's a detail I love about Leeuwenhoek. He was so protective of his lens grinding technique that he never fully shared it. He made over 500 microscopes in his lifetime, and when he died in 1723, at the age of 90, most of his secrets died with him. The quality of microscopy actually declined after his death. It took decades for instrument makers to catch up to what this self-taught draper had been doing in his workshop in Delft. There's something almost poignant about that. This window into the microbial world opening briefly, then partially closing again, waiting for technology to catch back up. But the seed was planted. And while the full germ theory of disease was still far off, the 17th and 18th centuries did see medicine grappling with one of its most devastating problems in a way that would eventually bear fruit. I'm talking about smallpox. And the story of how humanity fought smallpox is, honestly, one of the greatest stories in all of medicine, maybe in all of human history. Smallpox was a nightmare. If you've never really thought about what this disease was like, take a moment It killed roughly 3 out of every 10 people who caught it. 3 out of 10. And it was everywhere. In 18th century Europe, it was killing an estimated 400,000 people a year. It scarred survivors for life, deep, pitted scars across the face and body. It blinded people. It killed kings and commoners alike. It devastated indigenous populations in the Americas, where it had never existed before European contact, with mortality rates that are almost incomprehensible, sometimes wiping out 50, 60, 90% of a community. Smallpox shaped the fate of empires, and people noticed something. If you survived smallpox, you didn't get it again. That observation is ancient. People in many cultures recognized it, and in some parts of the world, people had been acting on that observation for centuries through a practice called variolation. The idea was deliberately exposing a healthy person to material from a mild smallpox case, dried scabs, pus from a lesion, in hopes of triggering a mild infection that would confer lifelong protection. It was practiced in China, possibly as early as the 10th century, where dried smallpox scabs were ground into powder and blown into the nose. It was practiced in parts of Africa, in India, across the Ottoman Empire. The practice reached European awareness largely through Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. She was in Constantinople in 1717, and she saw Turkish women performing variolation at gatherings. It was almost a social event. Lady Mary herself had survived smallpox a few years earlier, and it had left her badly scarred. Her brother had died of it, so she was deeply, personally motivated. She had her own son variolated in Constantinople, and when she returned to England, she championed the practice fiercely, pushing it into the teeth of enormous resistance from the medical establishment and the church, and variolation worked, mostly. It did confer protection, but here's the problem. It wasn't safe, because you were using actual smallpox material. You were giving people actual smallpox, a milder case, usually, hopefully. But somewhere between 1 and 2% of people who were variolated died of the procedure itself, and variolated people could spread full-blown smallpox to others. So you had this agonizing calculus. The procedure saved lives on a population level because smallpox itself killed 30%, and variolation killed maybe 2%. But telling a parent that there's a 1 in 50 chance this procedure will kill their child is a hard sell. It's a genuinely difficult ethical problem, and it was debated furiously throughout the 18th century. Then along came Edward Jenner, a country doctor in Gloucestershire, England, and Jenner's story is one of those cases where local knowledge, careful observation, and a willingness to act on a hunch changed the entire trajectory of human civilization. Jenner had heard the folk wisdom among dairy workers in the English countryside, milkmaids specifically, that if you'd had cowpox, You didn't get smallpox. Cowpox was a relatively mild disease that you could catch from infected cows. It caused some sores on the hands, a bit of fever, but it wasn't dangerous, and the milkmaids who'd had it seemed to be immune to smallpox. Their skin was famously clear and unscarred, which is actually where the cultural association between milkmaids and beauty comes from. Jenner took this folk observation and did something bold. On May 14th, 1796, he took material from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and inoculated it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed a mild cowpox reaction, a few sores, a slight fever, and recovered quickly. Then, about 6 weeks later, Jenner did something that would be absolutely unthinkable by modern ethical standards. He deliberately exposed the boy to smallpox. He variolated him with actual smallpox material, and nothing happened. The boy didn't get sick. He was immune. Jenner repeated the experiment on other subjects, compiled his results, and published them in 1798 in a work called An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae. He coined the term vaccination from vacca, the Latin word for cow. And that word, vaccination, would eventually come to describe one of the most powerful tools in all of medicine, applied to dozens of diseases far beyond smallpox. Now, Jenner faced skepticism and outright hostility. Some of it was reasonable scientific caution. His sample sizes were small. His methodology by modern standards was rough. Some of it was less reasonable. There were satirical cartoons showing vaccinated people sprouting cow parts from their bodies. The anti-vaccination movement, if you can believe it, is as old as vaccination itself. But the evidence accumulated. Vaccination was dramatically safer than variolation. It didn't cause smallpox. It didn't spread smallpox. And it worked. Oh, within a few years, vaccination was spreading across Europe. Napoleon had his entire army vaccinated. Thomas Jefferson promoted it in the United States. Spain organized the Balmis expedition in 1803, one of the most remarkable public health missions in history. A ship carrying 22 orphan boys who were vaccinated sequentially during the voyage to keep the cowpox virus alive arm to arm, sailed across the Atlantic and the Pacific, bringing vaccination to South America, the Philippines, and China. Think about the logistics of that. Think about the ambition. In an age of sailing ships and no refrigeration, they found a way to transport a living vaccine around the world using a chain of children's arms. And the long arc of this story is extraordinary. From Jenner's experiment in 1796, it took nearly 2 centuries. But in 1980, the World Health Organization officially declared smallpox eradicated, gone, the only disease in human history that we have deliberately, completely wiped off the face of the earth. A disease that killed hundreds of millions of people over the centuries, more than every war combined, eliminated through a global vaccination campaign. It's arguably the single greatest achievement of medicine, full stop. But here's what's interesting about Jenner's contribution in the broader arc we've been tracing. Jenner didn't know why vaccination worked. He had no concept of the immune system, no understanding of antibodies or T cells or immunological memory. He didn't know what viruses were. The word virus existed, but it just meant poison or venom, a vague term for whatever invisible agent caused disease. He couldn't see the cowpox virus. It's far too small even for Leeuwenhoek's best lenses. What Jenner had was observation, pattern recognition, and the courage to act on an empirical hunch. He saw that something worked, and he used it, even though the mechanism was completely opaque to him. And that's actually a recurring theme in medicine. Practice running ahead of theory. Treatments working for reasons nobody understands yet. The what being figured out long before the why. The why. The deep understanding of what causes infectious disease. That was the next great revolution, and it required going back to those animalcules that Leeuwenhoek had glimpsed 2 centuries earlier and finally connecting them to human illness. The germ theory of disease. And the 2 figures at the center of that revolution are Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, 2 men who could hardly have been more different in temperament, and whose rivalry would push both of them to extraordinary achievements. But before we get to Pasteur and Koch, there's a heartbreaking story that deserves to be told, because it shows just how close someone came to the germ theory decades before either of them, and how the medical establishment's resistance to new ideas could have fatal consequences, not just for patients, but for the person trying to save them. I'm talking about Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in Vienna in the 1840s, and his desperate, doomed campaign to get doctors to wash their hands before they touched laboring women. Semmelweis was working at the Vienna General Hospital, one of the largest hospitals in the world at the time, and it had 2 maternity clinics. The first clinic was staffed by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives. And here's the thing that haunted Semmelweis. Everyone knew, even the women coming in to give birth, that the first clinic was far more dangerous. The mortality rate from childbed fever, what we now call puerperal fever, was sometimes 5 times higher in the first clinic than in the second. Women would beg on their knees not to be admitted to the first clinic. Some preferred to give birth in the street rather than go there. And there's a grim irony in that, because women who gave birth in the street and then came to the hospital afterward actually had lower mortality rates than women who delivered inside the first clinic. Think about that. Giving birth on a dirty Vienna sidewalk was statistically safer than being attended by trained physicians in a modern hospital. Semmelweis was tormented by this. He couldn't figure out what was different. The 2 clinics used almost identical techniques. The women were from the same population. The only real difference was who was doing the delivering: doctors and medical students in one, midwives in the other. And then, in 1847, his friend Jakob Kolechka, a professor of forensic medicine, died after being accidentally nicked by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. When Semmelweis read the autopsy report on Kolechka, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The pathological findings, the abscesses, the inflammation, the organ damage, looked almost identical to what he saw in women who died of childbed fever, and suddenly a terrible connection formed in his mind. The medical students in the first clinic were going directly from performing autopsies on cadavers to examining women in labor. They'd wash their hands with soap and water, sure. But Semmelweis realized that wasn't enough. Something, he called it cadaverous particles, was clinging to their hands and being transferred into the women. The midwives in the second clinic didn't perform autopsies. That was the difference. So Semmelweis instituted a simple policy. Before examining any patient, doctors and students had to wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution, not just soap and water. Chlorinated lime, which actually destroyed whatever invisible agent was causing the infections, and the results were immediate and dramatic. The mortality rate in the first clinic dropped from around 10 or 12% to about 1 or 2%, essentially matching the second clinic. In some months, it dropped below 1%. He was saving lives almost overnight. You'd think this would be celebrated, right? You'd think the medical world would have embraced him. They didn't. And this is where the story turns painful. Semmelweis faced enormous resistance from the medical establishment. Part of it was scientific. He couldn't explain the mechanism. He didn't know about bacteria. He couldn't point to a specific organism and say, this is what's killing them. He just had this vague concept of cadaverous particles, which sounded almost mystical to his critics. Part of it was social and political. Semmelweis was Hungarian in a Viennese academic world that was deeply hierarchical and nationalistic, and he wasn't great at navigating institutional politics. But the deepest resistance was psychological, and this is important. What Semmelweis was really saying, when you stripped away the diplomacy, was that doctors were killing their own patients, that the hands of physicians, educated, well-meaning, respected physicians, were the instruments of death. That was an almost unbearable accusation. It implied guilt. It implied that every doctor who'd ever gone from the autopsy room to the delivery ward without properly disinfecting had blood on his hands, possibly hundreds of deaths worth. People don't accept that kind of accusation easily, even when the evidence is overwhelming. Semmelweis's contract at the Vienna General Hospital wasn't renewed. He returned to Budapest, where he did manage to implement his hand-washing protocols and achieved similarly dramatic results, mortality plummeting wherever he worked. But he couldn't get the broader medical world to listen. He wrote letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. He published a major book in 1861, The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, which laid out his evidence in exhaustive detail, but his writing was repetitive and disorganized, and his tone grew increasingly bitter and accusatory. He called doctors who refused to adopt hand-washing murderers. He wasn't wrong, exactly, but it wasn't a persuasive strategy. By the mid-1860s, Semmelweis's behavior had become erratic. Whether this was the result of an existing neurological condition, the psychological toll of years of rejection, or some combination, historians still debate. In 1865, he was committed to a mental asylum in Vienna. He died there just 2 weeks later, at the age of 47. The official cause was listed as blood poisoning from a wound on his hand, possibly inflicted during a beating by asylum guards, possibly from an injury sustained before admission. There's a terrible symmetry in that. The man who tried to save others from infection may have died of one himself. Now, the reason I'm spending time on Semmelweis isn't just because it's a tragedy, though it certainly is. It's because his story illuminates something fundamental about how medicine advances. The evidence was there. The data was clear. The intervention was simple and cheap, and it still took decades for the profession to accept it, because accepting it required doctors to fundamentally rethink their self-image and admit to a horrifying mistake. This pattern, evidence preceding acceptance by years or decades, institutional inertia, the human cost of delay, it repeats throughout medical history. You'll see it with antiseptic surgery, with the link between smoking and cancer, with hand hygiene in modern hospitals, which, believe it or not, is still a problem. Studies show that healthcare workers today comply with hand hygiene protocols only about 40 to 60% of the time, depending on the setting. Semmelweis would be appalled, but the point is that medical progress isn't just about discovering the right answer. It's about getting people to act on it. So let's talk about the people who finally provided the theoretical framework that Semmelweis lacked: the germ theory of disease. And we start with Louis Pasteur, a French chemist, not a physician, which is itself significant. Pasteur came to medicine sideways. He started his career studying crystals, tartaric acid crystals specifically, and made a brilliant early discovery about molecular chirality, the way certain molecules exist in mirror image forms. That's interesting chemistry, but it doesn't sound like it has much to do with disease, except that it led Pasteur to study fermentation because the tartaric acid came from wine production, and wine was a huge economic concern in France. French winemakers were losing enormous amounts of money to batches that went sour, and Pasteur was asked to figure out why. What he discovered in the late 1850s and early 1860s was that fermentation wasn't a purely chemical process, as most scientists believed. It was biological. Living microorganisms, yeasts, were responsible for turning sugar into alcohol, and when wine went bad, it was because different microorganisms, bacteria, had contaminated it and produced unwanted byproducts like lactic acid or acetic acid. This was a huge insight. It meant that specific microbes caused specific chemical changes, and Pasteur showed that you could kill these unwanted bacteria by heating the wine to a moderate temperature, not boiling it, just warming it enough to destroy the microbes without ruining the flavor. This process became known as pasteurization, and you encounter it every day. The milk in your refrigerator has been pasteurized. The juice you drink has been pasteurized. It's one of those engineering solutions, and I do think of it as engineering, biological engineering, that's so woven into daily life that you forget someone had to figure it out. But Pasteur didn't stop at fermentation. He went after one of the biggest scientific controversies of his era: spontaneous generation, the ancient belief that living organisms could arise from non-living matter. People still believed, even educated people, that maggots spontaneously appeared in rotting meat, that mice emerged from piles of grain, that microbes simply materialized in broth, left out in the open. Pasteur designed an elegant experiment using swan neck flasks, glass flasks with long, curved necks that allowed air in but trapped dust and microbes in the bend of the neck. He boiled broth in these flasks, and the broth stayed clear indefinitely. No microbes grew, but the moment he broke the neck of the flask, allowing dust particles to fall into the broth, it clouded with microbial growth within days. The microbes weren't appearing from nothing. They were coming from the environment, carried on dust, floating in the air. Life comes from life. This was 1859, the same year Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and between the two of them, the understanding of life on Earth was being fundamentally rewritten. Now, Pasteur's work on fermentation and spontaneous generation laid the intellectual groundwork, but he still hadn't directly proven that microbes cause disease in humans. That connection, the definitive link between specific bacteria and specific diseases, that was largely the achievement of Robert Koch, a German country doctor who could not have had a more different background from Pasteur. Koch was methodical, precise, almost obsessively systematic. He didn't have Pasteur's flair for public drama or his gift for self-promotion. What Koch had was an extraordinary ability to isolate and identify individual bacterial species, and a rigorous logical framework for proving that a particular microbe caused a particular disease. Koch's big breakthrough came in 1876 when he worked out the complete life cycle of Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax. Anthrax was devastating livestock across Europe, and Koch, working essentially alone in a makeshift laboratory, managed to grow the bacteria in pure culture outside the body, inject them into healthy animals, observe those animals developing anthrax, and then recover the same bacteria from the sick animals. This was the first time anyone had definitively demonstrated the full causal chain. This specific microbe, and no other, causes this specific disease. It was proof, not just correlation, not just a hunch. Koch would later formalize this logic into what we now call Koch's postulates, a set of 4 criteria that had to be met before you could claim a microbe caused a disease. The organism must be found in all cases of the disease. It must be isolated and grown in pure culture. The cultured organism must cause the disease when introduced into a healthy host, and it must be re-isolated from that new host. These postulates aren't perfect. We know now that some diseases don't fit neatly into this framework, that some pathogens can't be cultured, that healthy carriers exist. But as a starting point, as a logical discipline for a field that had been drowning in speculation and hand-waving, Koch's postulates were transformative, and Koch didn't stop with anthrax. In 1882, he identified Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, which was, at the time, responsible for roughly 1 in 7 deaths in Europe. 1 in 7. Think about what that means. If you lived in a European city in the 19th century, tuberculosis was the single most likely thing to kill you. They called it the White Plague, consumption, the captain of all these men of death. And Koch found the organism responsible. The announcement, made on March 24th, 1882, at a meeting of the Berlin Physiological Society, is considered one of the most important presentations in the history of medicine. The following year, Koch traveled to Egypt and India and identified Vibrio cholerae, the bacterium that causes cholera, another massive killer. In the span of just a few years, diseases that had terrorized humanity for centuries were being pinned to specific, identifiable, microscopic organisms. The invisible was becoming visible. The mysterious was becoming mechanical, and this is where things start accelerating. Because once you know what causes a disease, you can start figuring out how to prevent it and how to treat it. The germ theory didn't just explain disease, it opened the door to an entirely new kind of medicine. Antiseptic surgery, for instance. Joseph Lister, a British surgeon, read Pasteur's work on microorganisms and had the same kind of insight that Semmelweis had, but this time backed by a theoretical framework that the medical establishment could accept. If microbes cause infection, Lister reasoned, then killing those microbes during surgery should prevent wound infections. Starting in the mid-1860s, he began using carbolic acid as an antiseptic, spraying it on instruments, on wounds, even into the air of the operating theater. His results were dramatic. Post-surgical infection rates plummeted. And because Lister could point to Pasteur's germ theory as the explanation, because there was now a coherent scientific framework supporting the practice, the medical world was far more receptive than it had been to Semmelweis's pleas 2 decades earlier. It still took time. Change always takes time. But antiseptic surgery gradually became standard practice, and it evolved into the aseptic technique we use today, where the goal isn't just to kill microbes after the fact, but to prevent them from entering the surgical field in the first place. Sterile gloves, sterile gowns, autoclaved instruments, laminar airflow in operating rooms, all of it traces back to this moment, to the realization that the invisible world of microorganisms was the enemy, and that the enemy could be fought. Meanwhile, Pasteur himself was pushing into vaccines, circling back to what Jenner had started almost a century earlier, but now with a theoretical understanding of why vaccination worked. Pasteur developed vaccines for chicken cholera, for anthrax in livestock, and most famously, for rabies. The rabies vaccine story is extraordinary and controversial. In 1885, Pasteur treated a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister, who had been severely bitten by a rabid dog. Rabies was essentially a death sentence at the time. Once symptoms appeared, mortality was virtually 100%. Pasteur administered a series of increasingly virulent preparations of dried, rabies-infected spinal cord tissue over 11 days. It was a massive gamble. Pasteur wasn't a licensed physician. The vaccine hadn't been fully tested in humans, and if it failed or caused harm, his career and reputation would have been destroyed. But Meister survived. He never developed rabies. The news made Pasteur an international hero, and it cemented the idea that vaccines could be deliberately designed and manufactured, not just stumbled upon through folk observation like Jenner's cowpox insight. And now the pace of discovery becomes almost dizzying. The last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th saw an explosion of medical breakthroughs that built directly on the foundations of germ theory and the new scientific approach to medicine. Koch's laboratory in Berlin became a training ground for an entire generation of microbiologists who went on to identify the organisms responsible for diphtheria, typhoid, plague, tetanus, pneumonia, gonorrhea, disease after disease falling to the microscope and the culture plate. Emil von Behring, one of Koch's students, developed the first effective treatment for diphtheria using antitoxin serum, work that earned him the very first Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1901. Paul Ehrlich, another Koch protege, pioneered the concept of chemotherapy, not in the cancer sense we usually mean today, but in the original sense of using chemical compounds to selectively target and kill disease-causing organisms without harming the patient. Ehrlich called it the magic bullet, and his most famous success was salvarsan, an arsenic-based compound that was the first effective treatment for syphilis, introduced in 1910. It was toxic and difficult to administer, but it worked, and it proved the principle that you could design a chemical weapon against a specific microbe. But the truly world-changing moment in this lineage the discovery that arguably saved more lives than any other in human history, came from a completely different direction, and it came almost by accident. I'm talking about penicillin, and the story begins with Alexander Fleming in a cluttered London laboratory in September of 1928, staring at a petri dish that he'd left out on the bench before going on holiday. You know how it is. You go away for a couple of weeks, you come back, and the things you meant to clean up before you left are still sitting there. Fleming had been growing colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria, the kind that cause boils and wound infections. And when he returned to his lab at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, he noticed that one of the dishes had been contaminated. A blob of mold had landed on it, probably drifting in through an open window, and it was growing there amid the bacterial colonies. Now, most people would have just tossed the dish in the discard bin. Contaminated cultures were a nuisance, nothing more. But Fleming paused. He looked more closely, and what he saw was that around the mold there was a clear zone, a halo where the bacteria had simply dissolved. Something the mold was producing had killed the Staphylococcus. Fleming identified the mold as belonging to the genus Penicillium. It was Penicillium natum, specifically, and he called the antibacterial substance it produced penicillin. He published a paper on it in 1929, noting its remarkable ability to inhibit the growth of a range of dangerous bacteria. And then, not much happened. Fleming himself didn't have the chemistry expertise to isolate and purify the active compound, and his early attempts to use crude filtrates of the mold broth were inconsistent. The grueling chemical work needed to turn a mold juice into a usable medicine was beyond what his small lab could manage. He moved on to other projects. The paper sat in the literature, cited occasionally, largely forgotten. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because the gap between Fleming's observation in 1928 and penicillin actually saving lives is over a decade long, and it took a completely different team to bridge it. In 1938, Howard Florey, an Australian-born pathologist working at Oxford, and Ernst Boris Chain, a German-Jewish biochemist who had fled Nazi Germany, began systematically searching through the scientific literature for antimicrobial substances worth investigating. Chain came across Fleming's old paper on penicillin and brought it to Florey's attention. They assembled a team, including a brilliant biochemist named Norman Heatley, whose practical ingenuity turned out to be absolutely essential. And they set about doing what Fleming couldn't: extracting, purifying, and concentrating penicillin into something you could actually give to a patient. The work was painstaking. Penicillin is produced in tiny quantities by the mold, and it's chemically fragile. It breaks down easily. Heatley improvised an extraction system using ceramic bedpans and milk churns borrowed from the local dairy, because wartime Britain didn't exactly have a surplus of laboratory equipment. Think about that for a second. one of the most important medicines in human history, was first produced at scale using repurposed bedpans. They grew the mold in hundreds of shallow containers, collected the broth, and used a clever countercurrent extraction technique that Heatley devised to pull the penicillin out into a more concentrated form. By 1940, they had enough purified material to test on mice. They infected 8 mice with lethal doses of streptococcus, treated 4 with penicillin, and left 4 untreated. The next morning, the 4 treated mice were alive and well. The 4 controls were dead. Florey reportedly looked at the results and said, quietly, "It looks like a miracle." In February 1941, they tried it on a human patient for the first time, a policeman named Albert Alexander, who had scratched his face on a rose thorn and developed a raging infection that had spread to his eyes and scalp. They injected him with penicillin, and within 24 hours his condition improved dramatically. But here's the heartbreaking part. They ran out. They were so short on the drug that they were actually recovering it from Alexander's urine and repurifying it to inject again. But it wasn't enough. The infection came back, and Alexander died about a month later. They simply didn't have the quantities needed for a full course of treatment. This is what pushed Florey and Heatley to travel to the United States in the summer of 1941, carrying the precious penicillium mold with them. And there's a wonderful detail here. They didn't carry it in a vial or a test tube. They smeared it into the lining of their coat pockets because they were terrified of it being lost or confiscated during the transatlantic crossing. In America, they connected with the USDA's Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, where scientists figured out that you could grow the mold much more efficiently using deep fermentation in corn steep liquor, a waste product from corn processing that happened to be abundant in the Midwest. They also found a more productive strain of penicillium on a cantaloupe melon from a Peoria market. A moldy cantaloupe from a grocery store in Illinois became the ancestor of most of the world's penicillin production. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, and others, were producing penicillin on an industrial scale, and it arrived just in time for D-Day on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944. Allied medics carried penicillin with them, and it saved thousands of soldiers who in any previous war would have died from infected wounds. The mortality rate from bacterial infections in wounded soldiers dropped from roughly 12% in World War I to less than 1% by the end of World War II. That single number tells you everything about what penicillin meant. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945. And in his Nobel lecture, Fleming said something prophetic. He warned that bacteria could develop resistance to penicillin if the drug was used carelessly, if doses were too low or courses too short, giving the bacteria a chance to adapt rather than being wiped out completely. He was right, of course. Resistance began appearing almost immediately, and it's been an escalating arms race ever since. But we'll come back to that. The penicillin story opened the floodgates for what we call the antibiotic era. Selman Waxman, who actually coined the word antibiotic, led a systematic search through soil microorganisms at Rutgers University, and his lab discovered streptomycin in 1943, the first effective treatment for tuberculosis. His student Albert Schatz did much of the actual laboratory work, and the question of who deserved credit became a bitter dispute that went to court. Waxman got the Nobel in 1952. Schatz got a settlement and a lifetime of resentment. Science doesn't always handle credit well. Through the 1940s and 1950s, new antibiotics poured out of laboratories and pharmaceutical companies at an extraordinary rate. Chloramphenicol, tetracycline, erythromycin, vancomycin, each one targeted bacteria in a slightly different way, attacking different parts of their cellular machinery. Some disrupted the construction of bacterial cell walls. Others interfered with protein synthesis, gumming up the ribosomes that bacteria use to build the molecules they need to survive. Others blocked the replication of bacterial DNA. The diversity of mechanisms mattered, because it meant that when bacteria developed resistance to one drug, you could often switch to another. But here's the thing about bacteria. They evolve fast, incredibly fast. A single bacterium can divide every 20 minutes under ideal conditions, which means you can get through hundreds of generations in a single day. And with each generation, there's a chance of random mutations, some of which might confer resistance to an antibiotic. Even more troublingly, bacteria can share resistance genes with each other through a process called horizontal gene transfer. They literally pass little loops of DNA called plasmids from one cell to another, sometimes even between completely different species. So resistance doesn't just evolve within one bacterial lineage. It can spread sideways across the microbial world like gossip through a small town. By the 1960s, doctors were already encountering strains of Staphylococcus aureus that were resistant to penicillin, and the pharmaceutical industry responded by developing methicillin, a modified penicillin designed to evade the resistance mechanism. It worked for about a year. Then methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus appeared. MRSA. You've probably heard that acronym. It became one of the most feared hospital-acquired infections in the world, and it's still a serious problem today. And this is where the story takes a sobering turn, because while bacteria kept evolving resistance, the pipeline of new antibiotics started drying up. The easy discoveries had been made. The low-hanging fruit was picked. Developing a new antibiotic is expensive and technically difficult, and from a pharmaceutical company's perspective, the economics are terrible. You spend $1 billion developing a drug that doctors are then told to use as sparingly as possible, and that bacteria might render useless within a few years anyway. So companies shifted their research budgets toward more profitable areas: chronic diseases, lifestyle drugs, conditions where patients take medication for years or decades rather than a 10-day course. By the early 2000s, the number of new antibiotics reaching the market had slowed to a trickle, even as resistance was accelerating. The World Health Organization has called antibiotic resistance one of the greatest threats to global health. And they're not being dramatic. We are genuinely facing the possibility of a post-antibiotic era, a world where routine surgeries become dangerous again, where a simple cut could kill you, where pneumonia is once more a death sentence for the elderly. Fleming's 1945 warning turned out to be one of the most important predictions in the history of medicine. But let's not end on that note, because the story of modern medicine isn't just about antibiotics. Running in parallel with the antibiotic revolution was another transformation that's just as profound, even if it's less dramatic: the rise of medical imaging, the ability to see inside the living human body without cutting it open. And this story starts, like so many in medicine, with a moment of pure serendipity. In November of 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was experimenting with cathode rays in his laboratory at the University of Würzburg when he noticed something strange. A fluorescent screen across the room was glowing, even though the cathode ray tube was completely enclosed in thick black cardboard. Something was passing through the cardboard, something invisible, something he'd never encountered before. He called them X-rays, the X standing for unknown. And within weeks, he had produced the first radiographic image of a human body part: his wife Anna Bertha's hand, the bones clearly visible inside the flesh, her wedding ring a dark circle on her finger. When she saw the image, she reportedly said, "I have seen my death." It was eerie and beautiful, and it changed everything, because for the first time in all of human history, a physician could look inside a patient's body while that patient was still alive and breathing and sitting right there in front of them. Röntgen won the very first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901, and X-ray machines spread to hospitals around the world with astonishing speed. But the technology had a dark side that took years to fully understand, because no one yet knew what X-rays actually were doing to living tissue and the people who worked with them most closely: the radiologists, the technicians, the physicists, were absorbing enormous doses of radiation day after day. Many of them developed radiation burns, cancers, lost fingers, lost hands. Some died. The story of early radiology is genuinely tragic, and there's a memorial in Hamburg, Germany, the monument to the X-ray and radium martyrs, that lists over 350 names of medical professionals who died from radiation exposure in the early decades. They gave their lives, many of them unknowingly, to a technology that would go on to save millions and millions of lives. Think about that for a second. 350 people at least who didn't know what the invisible rays were doing to their cells, who kept working because they could see the extraordinary clinical value of what they were doing, who watched their own hands blister and ulcerate, and still came back to the lab the next morning. Some of them, like the American radiologist Miran Kasabian, meticulously documented their own deterioration, photographing their hands as the damage progressed, recording their symptoms, contributing their suffering to the medical literature so that future practitioners might be protected. Kasabian lost most of his fingers to radiation-induced cancers and died in 1910, and his detailed self-documentation became part of the foundation for radiation safety standards. It's one of those stories that sits right at the intersection of heroism and tragedy, and it reminds you that every medical technology we take for granted today was purchased in part with someone's pain. But the story of medical imaging didn't stop with X-rays. It kept evolving, and each new chapter brought another way of seeing inside the living body. By the mid-20th century, researchers were exploring the idea that sound waves, not radiation, not anything harmful, could be bounced off internal structures to create images. The principle was borrowed essentially from sonar, the technology that submarines use to detect objects underwater. You send out a pulse of sound, you wait for the echo to come back, and based on how long it takes and how strong the return signal is, you can map what's in front of you. An obstetrician in Glasgow named Ian Donald was one of the key figures in bringing this idea into clinical medicine. In the late 1950s, Donald and his colleague Tom Brown developed practical ultrasound imaging for obstetrics. And by the 1960s and 1970s, ultrasound had become the standard way to monitor pregnancies. And here's what's beautiful about it. No radiation, no risk to the mother or the fetus, just sound waves, harmless sound waves, painting a picture of the baby in the womb. If you've ever seen an ultrasound image of an unborn child, that grainy, ghostly, impossibly moving picture of a tiny human curled up inside another human, you've witnessed the direct descendant of Ian Donald's work in Glasgow. And then came the real revolution in imaging, the one that would have seemed like pure science fiction to Röntgen. In the early 1970s, a British engineer named Godfrey Hounsfield, working at EMI, yes, the same EMI that was the Beatles' record label, which is one of those delightful facts that sounds made up but isn't. Hounsfield developed the first practical computed tomography scanner, the CT scanner. The basic idea is that you take X-rays from many different angles around the body and then use a computer to reconstruct those flat images into cross-sectional slices. Instead of a single shadow on a film, You get a detailed map of the body's interior, slice by slice, as if someone had taken an impossibly thin knife and cut through you at every level. Hounsfield shared the 1979 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine with Alan Cormack, a South African-born physicist who had independently worked out the mathematical foundations for the technique. The first clinical CT scanners were used primarily for brain imaging, and the difference they made was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, doctors could see tumors, bleeding, structural abnormalities, things that had previously required exploratory surgery just to diagnose. And almost simultaneously, another imaging technology was taking shape, one that used no radiation at all. Magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, grew out of the physics of nuclear magnetic resonance, a phenomenon that had been studied since the 1940s. The key insight, developed for medical imaging primarily by Raymond Damadian, Paul Lauterbur, and Peter Mansfield through the 1970s, was that when you place the human body inside a very strong magnetic field and then pulse it with radio waves, the hydrogen atoms in your tissues respond in slightly different ways depending on what kind of tissue they're in. Water-rich tissue responds differently from fat-rich tissue, which responds differently from muscle, which responds differently from a tumor. By detecting these subtle differences and processing them through clever mathematics, you can build extraordinarily detailed images of soft tissue, the brain, the spinal cord, joints, organs, with a clarity that CT simply couldn't match for certain applications. Lauterbur and Mansfield shared the 2003 Nobel Prize for their contributions, though Damadian's exclusion from that prize remains one of the more contentious episodes in Nobel history. He took out full-page newspaper ads protesting the decision. But regardless of who gets the credit, MRI transformed neurology, orthopedics, oncology, really almost every branch of medicine. If you've ever had a knee injury and been slid into that loud, clanging tube, that experience, as uncomfortable as it might have been, gave your doctor a window into your body that no physician in history had before the 1980s. Now, I want to pull back for a moment and think about what all of this means together, because the story of medical imaging is really a story about knowledge and humility. For most of human history, and we've traced this all the way back, haven't we? From those Mesopotamian healers with their diagnostic handbooks, through Galen's confident but often wrong anatomy, through Vesalius finally cracking open the body and drawing what he actually saw. For most of that long arc, physicians were essentially guessing about what was happening inside a living patient. They could feel a lump. They could listen to a heartbeat. They could observe symptoms. But the interior of the body was a black box. Every imaging technology, from Röntgen's first X-ray to a modern functional MRI that can show which parts of your brain light up when you think about your mother, has been another step in opening that box. And each step changed not just what doctors could see, but what they could do, which brings us gently to the broader landscape of modern medicine, because imaging is just one thread in a tapestry that became almost unimaginably complex in the 20th century. Think about what converged. You had antibiotics. We talked about penicillin and the golden age of antibiotic discovery. You had vaccines, that beautiful lineage from Jenner's cowpox to the global eradication of smallpox. You had anesthesia, which we haven't even touched on much, but which transformed surgery from a horrifying ordeal of speed and restraint into something precise and deliberate. Ether was first publicly demonstrated as a surgical anesthetic in 1846 at Massachusetts General Hospital in what became known as the Ether Dome, a moment so dramatic that the surgeon, after removing a tumor from a patient who felt nothing, turned to the audience and said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." You had antisepsis and then asepsis, Lister's carbolic acid giving way to the sterile operating theaters we know today. You had blood transfusion, blood typing, Karl Landsteiner's discovery of the ABO blood groups in 1901, which finally explained why some transfusions saved lives and others killed. You had insulin, isolated by Banting and Best in 1921, turning type 1 diabetes from a death sentence into a manageable condition almost overnight. Each of these was its own epic story, its own chain of human struggle and insight and failure and breakthrough. And then, in the second half of the 20th century, something happened that changed the entire framework of medicine. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick, building on the crucial X-ray crystallography work of Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins, published the structure of DNA, the double helix, and with that, medicine began its long pivot from treating the body as a collection of organs and systems to understanding it as a collection of molecular instructions. It took decades for this insight to translate into practical medicine, but when it did, the implications were staggering. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003 after 13 years of international effort, mapped the entire human genetic code, roughly 3 billion base pairs, the complete instruction manual for building a human being. And from that foundation, we've entered an era of medicine that would be genuinely incomprehensible to every physician we've talked about tonight, from the Ashipu of ancient Babylon to Fleming in his cluttered lab at St. Mary's. Today, we have targeted cancer therapies designed to attack specific molecular mutations in a specific patient's tumor. We have CRISPR, a gene-editing tool discovered through the study of bacterial immune systems. There's a beautiful irony there. Bacteria defending themselves against viruses, and us learning to use that same mechanism to edit our own DNA. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier shared the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for that work, and the therapeutic applications are still unfolding. We have mRNA vaccines, And this is worth pausing on, because the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 put this technology in front of the entire world. The Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines were designed fundamentally in a matter of days once the genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 was published in January 2020. Days. The months that followed were about testing, manufacturing, scaling. But the core design happened almost instantly because the mRNA platform had been in development for years, largely through the persistent, often underfunded work of researchers like Katalin Kariko, who spent decades refining the technology while struggling to get grants, being demoted, being told the approach was a dead end, and then, when the world needed it most, her work was ready. She shared the 2023 Nobel Prize in Physiology, or Medicine, and her story is one of those reminders that the breakthroughs that save millions often begin with one stubborn person who refuses to give up on an idea. So here we are, at the end of this long, winding journey through the history of medicine, from a Neanderthal chewing yarrow in a dark cave to mRNA vaccines designed on a computer in a weekend. And what strikes me, looking back over all of it, is how consistent the underlying impulse has been. Every single person we've talked about tonight, the Egyptian physicians writing on papyrus, Hippocrates insisting that disease had natural causes, Vesalius cutting into cadavers because he refused to trust a 1,500-year-old textbook, Jenner scraping cowpox into a boy's arm, Semmelweis begging his colleagues to wash their hands, Pasteur bent over his flasks, Fleming noticing something strange on a contaminated plate, Florey and Chain scrambling to produce enough penicillin to save one man's life, Hounsfield building a scanner in a lab funded by Beatles royalties, Kariko working alone on mRNA when no one would listen. Every single one of them was driven by the same fundamental thing. They saw suffering, and they wanted to make it stop. They saw a mystery, and they wanted to understand it. They saw a limit, and they wanted to push past it. That's what medicine is, really. It's not just science, though it is science. It's not just technology, though it depends on technology. It's a deeply human enterprise, maybe the most human enterprise there is. This stubborn, beautiful refusal to accept that suffering is inevitable. This insistence that we can do better, that we can understand more, that we can help, and the story isn't over. It's never over. Right now, tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is in a lab and they're looking at something they don't quite understand yet, and they're thinking, what if? What if this is the key? What if this changes everything? And maybe it will. Maybe it won't. But they'll keep working, because that's what we do. That's what we've always done. And you, lying there, breathing slowly, maybe already half asleep, you're part of this story too. Every vaccine you've ever received, every antibiotic that cleared an infection, every X-ray or scan that showed a doctor what was wrong, all of it connects back to this long, improbable, deeply human chain of curiosity and care that stretches back thousands and thousands of years. So let that thought settle. Let it be a quiet, comforting thing. The world is full of people trying to understand, trying to heal, trying to help. It always has been. And as you drift off, as the details blur and the names fade, and all that's left is the gentle hum of that idea, well, that's enough. That's more than enough. Rest now. You're in good hands. You always have been.